Is Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings worth reading for a new reader or someone who doesn't really read a lot? Well, in today's spoiler-free review, we will get right into that.
Yeah, editor, if you want to put a cool intro video here, that'd be cool. Thank you.
Yeah, so today I just finished Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings. And if you're like me, you might not be much of a reader. Maybe you were a bit of a reader when you were younger, and as you've gotten older, you have kind of slowed down on reading, or you don't read a lot for fun. Me personally, I primarily read for education stuff, theology, things of that nature, philosophy. I like those kind of books, but I don't read a whole bunch of those throughout the year, much less than I would like to admit. And so this year, I've decided I'm going to try to read a little bit more. It is February 1st when I'm recording this, so the very beginning of February. In January, I have read 3 books, one being Horus Rising for the Horus Heresy, the Warhammer book, another one being just another smaller book, Android's Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, and now this big honkin' lad, The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. And if you're on TikTok or YouTube at all, and you kind of get the book algorithm in these places, you've probably heard of The Way of Kings. You've definitely heard of Brandon Sanderson. He's also maybe one of the biggest content creators in the book world today, not just in terms of writing books and creating books, but also creating YouTube content about books or just writing in general. And so The Way of Kings has been regarded as one of the greatest or one of the best epic fantasies to come out in many years. You hear it in a lot of conversations with things like Game of Thrones or, well, I don't know. Once again, I am a fantasy noob. I'm not someone who really resonates with fantasy. I love the Lord of the Rings movies. I've tried to read the books a billion times, and I just can't get into them, or I couldn't get into them in the past. Maybe I can now, who knows? But a lot of other fantasy stuff just kind of, it's really hard for me to read. I don't know why it had never clicked with me before. I read the Harry Potter books growing up as a kid, as many of you have, but as I got older, fantasy stuff just never stuck with me. But I've heard enough good things about The Way of Kings that I kind of considered reading it. After I finished Horus Rising by Dan Abnett, the Horus Heresy, the first book in the Horus Heresy book series, I was like, man, I'm kind of digging this reading thing. This is fun. And so for me, with this excitement, this newfound excitement for reading, I actually kind of questioned myself, could I read something as daunting as The Way of Kings? If you don't know, and if you're watching this video, you probably do know, like right now, this is around a little over 1,200 pages for a book. It's one of the longest books I've ever read, if not the longest. And so it's an intimidating thing to pick up. But I'm going to tell you, in today's review, I'm going to break down, one, you already know kind of where I stand as a reader. I'm not that much of a reader until now. And how long it took me to read, and some general thoughts and some of the themes of this book to see if this is worth you picking up or worth you reading. I will say this 1,200 something page book, I think it's like 380 something thousand words or somewhere around there, like almost nearly as long as the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So that gives you an idea of how long this first of 5 books is. Not technically 5, there's still some smaller books in there as well, but was it worth the time to kind of read this? And I will say, I was actually really surprised. I finished this book in about 2 weeks, about 2 weeks time. I didn't think that I would be able to read something quite this long. I'm not that quick of a reader, but I did spend a lot of time reading. Normally I like to try to read multiple books at a time. With this bad boy, the only thing I read was The Way of Kings. So in 2 weeks, pretty much any bit of free time I had, I read this book. I still managed to put like 10 hours into The Witcher 3 also somehow, but yeah, in 2 weeks time I was able to finish this. So if you're worried about the time constraint, or the time commitment, I should say, about this book, I will say, if you are enjoying it, I think you're going to fly through it much quicker than you anticipate you're going to. One of the reasons being is the way that this book is written. If you are new to fantasy, or your only experience with fantasy is, say, the Harry Potter books, or something like Lord of the Rings, this steers much closer to something like Harry Potter than it does Lord of the Rings in terms of the way that it's written. It is not quite a young adult novel. It is a pretty simple book to read in terms of the way that it's structured. There's not a lot of flowery verbiage or poetic prose in this. It is a pretty straightforward book. Not to say that there isn't beautiful moments in this, and not to say that it is a fully modern book. No, like, this is an epic fantasy tale. But with that being said, it is a pretty simple book to read. Like, you have to get through all of the fantasy words that you're not familiar with and try to, like, just kind of move forward through those as Brandon kind of introduces you to the world to let you know what those are. But it's not that intimidating of a read once you actually get to reading it. But once again, 2 weeks is a lot of time to commit to reading a book when that's kind of all you're doing with your free time. So is that 2 weeks well worth spent? Like, is that actually worth the investment of doing this? That's going to be hard to say because there are 5 books into this series. So ultimately we don't know what the payoff is, or I don't know what the payoff is for all 5 of those books. Someone who's read them can be able to tell you that. I know the last book has been, there's been some controversy around it, whether or not there's an actually great payoff in it. The payoff, though, in The Way of Kings is incredible within this book itself. The questions that you ask, the kind of story and character arcs that you go through within this book all pay off extremely satisfying. Wow, that English was terrible. In an extremely satisfying way. I actually really... here's the thing. It's hard to get into this without spoiling it, but we're not going to. We're going to do our best not to. The Way of Kings follows 3 or 4 different main characters and 3 or 4 different character arcs. Most of those I found to be enthralling throughout. One in particular was a bit of a slog to get through. The reason being, in those sections, it's a lot of talk of academia, it's a lot of talk of philosophy, and it's just a lot of talk. Not to say that dialogue's a bad thing, but you're spending a lot of time reading about someone reading a book. That's not the most enthralling thing to me, especially juxtaposed to everything else in this book where everything just kind of flies by. There are a couple of flashbacks and stuff that are all entertaining, and they also give you really great context of the character and where that character is at there, and also does a great job of revealing more about that character in a really fascinating way. You don't get those flashbacks that give all the answers, right at the beginning. A lot of those are held to the end to sort of let you know where this character is at and gives you a greater understanding of who they are and their motivations behind what they do. And so all of those characters, the arcs are fantastic and entertaining throughout. One is slow, but what I was saying about payoff, the one that was slow, the one that I had issues with, the one that I kind of... Here's the thing with that particular character. When I would finish a chapter, if I saw that the next chapter was going to be about a certain character, I had to wrestle with, do I go ahead and read this so that way I can, the next time I go to open the book, it will be about a character that I enjoy, or do I just wait to read this because I don't want to read it at the moment? And so I did that a couple of times, just kind of wrestling how to best handle that. With that being said, what happens with that character towards the end of this book, really the last half of this book and the last quarter of this book, it is so extremely hard to put down. It is enthralling. The payoff is so satisfying, and I'm going to say, like, some of these characters are some of my favorite characters in any sort of fiction, whether it be movies, TV shows. I don't have a lot of experience with books, but I have grown to love these characters so much. And a lot of that comes from, one, the big moments that happen in this book. There are, you know, if you are someone who might be a fan of the TV show Game of Thrones, you know that show is kind of really built on some of its big moments, the political scheming, but really it is the shocking moments that kind of made Game of Thrones as popular as it was in the mainstream. It was the big twists and the big turns. There are a couple of those in this. Don't go into this reading, oh, I'm excited for the twisty turny book of something like Game of Thrones in this. You're not really going to get that. There are some big twists, some major twists, and some things that are very upsetting in this book. But the big moments, what I like about this is, man, there's some wholesome, just get hyped moments in this. And it's my favorite thing about, like, anime, for example. Like shonen anime, like anime that's made for, you know, typically younger people and specifically younger boys to watch and get excited about. Things like Naruto or One Piece, Attack on Titan as well. Calling that a shonen is probably a stretch, but there are those moments where you're like, okay, this is the time that I'm gonna get excited seeing Goku turn Super Saiyan for the first time. I'm gonna tell you, this book's got that. In more ways than one. I think the Way of Kings moments, and its best moments, while there are fantastic quieter moments with characters and small little discussions, the big moments of this just go so hard and are absolutely incredible. And so for those big moments alone, I think this is worth checking out. Particularly, especially if this becomes adapted into TV shows or movies, which I would say can happen and probably should happen. I think The Way of Kings would make an excellent anime. The way that Brandon Sanderson stylizes the action in this is so reminiscent of things like Attack on Titan, or even flashier animes like, say, something like a Dragon Ball Z or a Naruto, or even like Bleach. Like, there's a lot of similarities there. So while I would like to see a live action Way of Kings TV show or movie, an anime of the Way of Kings would be, that would be fire. Done with the right studio, of course. But anyways, so if you are someone who wants good characters that you can connect to, big epic moments, you know, the masculine urge to die in a final stand, the super stylized action, which, you know, maybe that's just my brain creating it, but the way that this reads is just, there's so much style in the way that the action is portrayed in The Way of Kings. If you want that, this has it, man. This has all of that. And not to mention, and probably one of the biggest selling points, or the biggest things that you take away from this book are kind of what it does thematically, what it does with the idea of depression and grief. I think it's a really interesting look at depression, and not just like a situational depression, but like a clinically diagnosed depression. Someone who is dealing with the ups and downs that aren't purely there due to circumstance, and how to wrestle with that. Then also is an interesting book talking about responsibility and leadership, and kind of the value of a person. What is the value of a person? There's some deep stuff in here that doesn't feel like it's trying to be deep, but it just accomplishes it by telling the story. There are moments, the moments that I don't like in this book are when they get a little too on the nose talking about philosophy, or talking about what it means to be a leader, or whatever, or what does it mean to be morally right. Some of that stuff is a bit hard and a bit of a slog to get through. But when the story kind of just lets you experience those ideas as the story goes, bro, it's just absolutely incredible. And so, for all of those things, if you are, once again, someone who's not much of a reader, once again, it took me 2 weeks to get through this when this is pretty much all I did in my free time. I am not a fast reader. I know some people who've gotten through this in like 3 days. You guys are insane. But this is worth it. The payoff at the end, by the time I closed this book, I really wanted more. My intention fully was to finish this book and hop straight into False Gods by Graham McNeil. It was the second book in the Horus Heresy series. That's going to be really hard to do now, knowing that I have 4 more books to read in this series. And here's the thing. I like this so much. So when I bought this, I bought the collection where it has the first 3 books. I also just went to the store today and bought Brandon Sanderson's Edge Dancer and Dawn Shard. So these are much shorter. They are kind of like little things to read in between some of the other major or the main line releases. I also ended up getting Rhythm of War, and I have not bought the newest and the last book of this arc. I'm kind of waiting until the mass published paperback comes out for that, because one, I could have gotten that one no problem in hardback or in a much larger form paperback, but when these sit on my shelves, I want them to look kind of similar, so I'm just gonna stick around and wait for that. So I love this book so much. I got into reading because of Warhammer. I got into digging into lore and deep fantasy stuff because of Warhammer. I have a billion other books that I've bought because of Warhammer. Not just Warhammer books, but other fantasy books, and this is one of those. Man, between this and kind of the next book in that series, and I also just picked up The Will of the Many, which has been getting a lot of hype as well. It's going to be really hard to decide what to read next, because I just kind of want to see what else happens in this series. I know for some people, like I said before, the last book in this arc was not satisfying to them, but hey, if we can get a good couple of books out of this, and I think I'm going to enjoy my time with them, I think it's going to be worth the time spent, the money spent into this. So if you are on the fence of hopping on The Way of Kings, I highly recommend it. I think it's really good. Don't let the page number scare you. Don't try to finish it in a very specific amount of time. Don't hear my 2 weeks to finish it and say, hey, I have to be able to finish it in that amount of time. Don't look online and see people finishing it in a week or 3 days and make that feel like you're inadequate and unable to finish this book, like this honker of a book. You can do it, and I think you will enjoy it. It may take you a couple hundred pages for it to really set its hooks in. I think it actually starts off very strong, but it took quite a long time for me to be like, well, I have to know what happens to these characters next. But once I got to that point, this has become one of my favorite things I've ever read. And, I did not consider myself a reader before. I think reading this book has kind of officially turned the page on that. And I think reading's just a blast. It's a great way to spend your time. So, once again, if you're new to reading, new to fantasy, check it out. I think it's really good. Maybe if you're still on the fence and kind of afraid of its length, maybe check out Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series. I haven't read that at all, but I've heard nothing but great things about that, and I hear it's also a little bit more approachable than something like The Way of Kings. But that's it for now. Once again, next book that I'm going to probably read and hopefully review if I enjoy it enough is going to be one of these. It'll be The Will of the Many or False Gods by Graham McNeil. I don't know. Or it might end up being the next book in the Stormlight Archive series. I could put these books down, but just we're not going to. We're gonna say goodbye like this. If you've read the Stormlight Archive, if you've read The Way of Kings, let me know what you think in the comments below. Let other readers who are new readers give them your opinion of why they should or shouldn't pick up The Way of Kings, or if you have another recommendation for them, drop it off in the comments. But for now, take it easy.